All right, we're recording.
Okay. Hello, welcome to one of 3 related panels for the Latinx Literature and Culture Society. This one is Latinx Sci-fi and the Dystopian. I'm Cathryn Merla-Watson, and I'm a co-chair with Cristina Herrera. So we will begin with, and please correct my pronunciation. I should have asked you beforehand how to pronounce your name, but María Célleri, who will be giving the talk Lunar Braceros 2125 to 2148, Dystopian or Utopian DeColonial Imaginary. And excuse me, so Célleri is an assistant professor in gender, women's and sexuality studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She earned her PhD in ethnic studies from UC San Diego and master's degrees in women's, gender, and sexuality studies and in Hispanic languages and literatures. Her current book project, Uncovering the Virgen del Panecillo, Quito's post-colonial urban transformation and decolonial future imaginaries, which examines the political and symbolic importance of the monument of the Virgen del Panecillo in a cultural research study of how monuments come to represent and often reproduce national imaginations. Her research interests include Indian studies, Latinx studies, decolonial feminism, and cultural studies. And so without further ado, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen very quickly. So thank you for that introduction. This particular presentation is a small part of what's going to end up being the probably last chapter of my upcoming book. And so I'm very excited to share some initial thoughts on this particular novel that I'm working with. So Lunar Braceros 2125 to 2148 was published back in 2009. Its co-authors, Rosario Sanchez and Beatriz Pita, are queer Chicana scholars. They're both professors in the literature department at UC San Diego, which is also my alma mater. UC San Diego is a space where speculative fiction and science fiction has flourished with the relocation of the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Workshop to the campus back in 2007. The novella that they co-wrote is a dystopian speculative fiction tale that takes place in a future century at a moment where mineral resources on Earth have been expended to the point where the 2 major world superpowers left, the New World Order and China, have colonized the moon as a dump site for nuclear waste and mineral extraction. Lunar Braceros is an excellent example of a dystopian future in which capitalist advancements, neoliberalism, and technology have continued to exponentially destroy natural resources and exploit racialized labor forces. But it also highlights the formation of collective enclaves of resistance that make possible imagining alternative future utopias. Shelley Strebe, in her work, she's also part of the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Workshop at UC San Diego. Strebe reminds us that the dichotomy utopia-dystopia is a false distinction between 2 speculative imaginaries since, quote, not all dystopias are anti-utopian. In fact, there are utopian elements in many dystopias. Instead, she distinguishes between utopia and anti-utopias. Anti-utopias assume that human nature is somehow fundamentally flawed, that humans are irreparably greedy, and therefore a utopian future where social relations are altered is completely impossible. On the other hand, dystopias reveal the severe effects of uncontrollable greed, capitalism, exploitation, environmental devastation, but at the same time, they do leave open the possibility for resistance, which is what I'm interested in my reading of Lunar Braceros. So informed by true historical accounts, dystopian speculative fiction serves as the bridge between what has been and what could be through fantastical accounts that, while fictional, are eerily reminiscent of present-day circumstances. In my analysis of the novella, I consider the possibility of Chinganasa, the only autonomous collective space left on Earth, as a future decolonial utopia in the Andean region. I argue that Chinganasa acts as a decolonial feminist utopia in which people and land are equally respected and whose relationship is reciprocal rather than extractive. It is a place of queer kinship where nuclear heteronormative families are transformed into collective familial kinships, and where indigenous histories of the land and of resistance are respected and preserved. My analysis considers if and how the decolonial imaginary threads between utopia and dystopia through everyday acts of resistance, which I argue is connected to the Quechua and Aymara concept of Pachakuti, which I'm going to define later. So Lunar Braceros is told from multiple perspectives. It follows the lives of Lydia and Frank, who are two low-wage workers that are sent to the moon to work as Lunar Braceros. They have to dispose of chemical waste on the moon. After discovering that they are not going to return to Earth alive, they must find ways of organizing and rebelling on the moon to make their safe return to Earth. They start to realize that rather than being brought back, it's more fiscally responsible for the New World Order to kill them on Earth rather than send them back. So they finally organize and do return on Earth. Once on Earth, they flee to Chinganasa, which is an indigenous-led community in present-day Ecuador, specifically in the Amazonian region. Chinganasa is established by an indigenous movement that was formed throughout the 21st century and was inspired by the Zapatista movement in Chiapas, as well as by the formation of the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, also known as CONAIE, in the 21st century. In Chinganasa, everything is done communally, including working the land, selling surplus food, making and selling crafts to pay for electricity. Maintaining a communal lifestyle functions as a direct challenge to the capitalist system that has led to the destruction of Earth and the moon, as well as imagines how a return to indigenous ways of life will combat widespread exploitation. Chinganasa is led by indigenous leaders and principles, and all of the Chicanx and other non-native characters all respect the rules and follow them. After the Lunar Braceros rebel and they escape successfully, they know that they can't return home to Cali, Texas. Therefore, Chinganasa is not only the safest place that they can go, but it is also the place that ultimately challenges the exploitative ways of life that created the circumstances for their exile in the first place. So in my larger book project, I'm interested in theorizing decolonialism in the context of present-day Ecuador, which is why I was led to this particular novella. I consider decolonization as a necessary utopian imaginary that we must continue to contend with if we are to resist the current dystopian reality that is ongoing extractivism and environmental devastation, ongoing indigenous displacement, xenophobic responses to incoming migration. For Ecuador, that means migration from Colombia and Venezuela, feminicide, and attacks on reproductive justice struggles, including the legalization of abortion. To continue to engage in this radical framework of undoing, I insist that we, just humanity at large, must without delay move towards a new way of life and being in the world. This radical way of thinking is what I call Andean decolonial feminism, and it's framed from the Quechua and Aymara concept of Pachakuti. While I too often waver between a feeling of impending doom and hope, very specifically this year and last year, I consider Micah Donahue's assertion that for every apocalypse, a utopia follows. The cycle of apocalypse and utopia is what Quechua and Aymara peoples have called Pachakuti. It's the idea that the world, all of time and space, must undergo catastrophes and rejuvenations in circular, large cycles. As Aymara scholar Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui explains, the colonization of the Americas was a moment of catastrophe, but all moments of catastrophe are ultimately followed by moments of rejuvenation. In this imaginary, decolonization is the act of rejuvenating and beginning a new life cycle for Pachakuti. Rather than an unreachable utopia, in Andean indigenous cosmology, decolonization is inevitable. It's just part of the historical cycle that will eventually follow colonization. I argue that Pachakuti is a utopian decolonial project that challenges Western concepts of linear time. Much like speculative fiction, which disrupts smooth transitions between past and future, Pachakuti engages a radical undoing of chronological time and allows us to understand how the past is often going to reemerge in the present and influence the future. I engage speculative fiction as the genre that enhances this revisionist possibility in decolonial ways. So the plot of the novella unfolds via what in the novel they call nanotechs that Lydia writes to her son Pedro before she leaves from Chinganasa back to Cali, Texas to fight in the revolution. These archival materials serve multiple functions. The nanotexts are the only thing that Pedro has left of Lydia, whose narrative voice is always already in between the past and the future. Since she's recounting the past for Pedro and he's reading them in future time. They are potentially the only archives that document a successful insurgent escape by Lunar Braceros, who until then were being murdered before returning to Earth. So we assume they're the only ones that have successfully escaped. And as such, the narrative or the nanotexts themselves act as a threat to the new imperial order. On the other hand, as Lydia says in one of the nanotexts, the story of her survival in the reservations, her politicization in the anarchist group Anarco-Maquis that landed her in prison momentarily, her successful escape from the moon to Chinganasa, and her decision to leave Pedro to continue fighting all act as, quote, models for you and others like you to build a new beginning elsewhere. At one point, one of the characters, Frank, exclaims, historicize, historicize, which Sanchez and Pita continuously do throughout the novella. The speculative future which they present to us between the years 2125 to 2148 is informed by a long hemispheric history of conflict and resistance ranging from the 1500s into the 22nd century, including, just to name a few important historical accounts that they base their story on, is Hernán Cortés's conquest of the Aztec Empire, the colonial Western expansion in North America through Manifest Destiny and the creation of native reservation systems, obviously the Bracero program, the formation of CONAIE, and the Zapatista uprising. Pachakuti is an everyday act of undoing the catastrophic, almost apocalyptic violence of colonialism. Just like colonialism has not ended in the post-colony, decoloniality is an ongoing project. In Lunar Bracero, violence and resistance does not begin in 2125, nor does it end in 2148 or with Pedro. Similarly, history, conflict, and resistance for Ecuador did not begin in the 1500s with the conquest of the America. There was a lot of conflict with the Incan Empire. It did not end for Ecuador in 1822 when it gained independence from Spain. It did not end with the formation of CONAIE in the 1980s or the indigenous uprisings in the 1990s. It certainly did not end with the leftist presidencies of Rafael Correa and much less that of Lenin Moreno. And we can safely speculate it's going to continue even after the inevitable fall of capitalism. What Pachakuti allows us is to reframe Western linear concepts of history as limited concepts of time-space, which disregard longer histories of resistance and even when future-oriented, cannot imagine time or space outside of its own demise. Pachakuti encompasses not just historical time before the conquest, the time of the Incan Empire, but a much longer history of all living things before its documentation and into the inevitable speculative future. In the DeColonial Imaginary, Emma Perez defines the DeColonial Imaginary as a political project that negotiates between the colonial and the post-colonial, or what happens in the in-between, in the time lag between the moment that is and the moment that has yet not happened. She goes on to explain that to surpass the time lag that is to enter the decolonial imaginary, colonial subjects must reconfigure all power relations. Similarly, Rivera Cusicanqui explains that decolonization is an everyday act that must begin with the decolonization of gender, the recuperation of the feminine, the indigenous, and a code of ethics that is responsible for all living beings. Decolonial feminism is a framework that challenges Western normative constructions of dichotomous sex gender and heteronormative sexuality. Indeed, a decolonial feminist project requires the understanding that the colonization of gender and sexuality were imperative to the colonial ordering. Queer decolonial scholars such as María Lugones have demonstrated how colonialism necessitated inequitable relationships between male and female within a patriarchal power structure that legitimized man's control over land, labor, and knowledge production. The queer kinship relationship that Sánchez and Pita create in Lunar Braceros helps us imagine what would the destruction of the heteronormative nuclear family look like if familial relationships were replaced for communal kinships based on just collective care. Pedro represents, in the novella, the future of this queer kinship relationship. Biologically, Pedro is conceived from Lydia's eggs and Gabriel's sperms, which were frozen and preserved in a cryonics lab before Gabriel died in Brazil, persecuted for his activism, and before Lydia left to the moon. Left infertile from her exposure to toxic waste chemicals on the moon, Lydia is not able to carry the child, and Leticia, her friend, acts as Pedro's surrogate. After he's born, he's raised by Lydia and now her new partner, Frank, and by Leticia and her partner, Maggie, after she leaves, and then later by Tom and Betty, who stay behind in Chinganasa to raise him along with Waman, who's their adopted child. It's like very convoluted. The destruction of the traditional nuclear family in the novella directly challenges the role that the nuclear family unit has played in the forced colonial assimilation of indigenous family units across the Americas. Making the nuclear family unit the model for social familial arrangements implied forcing strict gender roles for men and women, which worked to safeguard control over women's bodies and labor. It also legitimized an inequitable division of labor through a patriarchal lens that placed women in a subordinate role to men. So therefore, a decolonial feminist project must work to challenge patriarchal Western traditional gender roles, compulsory heteronormativity, and the enforcement of the nuclear family. So, and I'm wrapping up right now. So while my analysis of the novella thus far points to how Sánchez and Pita successfully provide an alternative speculative future founded on a decolonial feminist imaginary, I want to posit that the end of the novella leaves the readers to speculate on the author's speculation. In her analysis of the role of motherhood or lack thereof in Lunar Bracero, Christy Ulibarri is concerned by the open ending of the novella, which centers Pedro as a younger generation that's left to fight the revolution of the future. Yet this future revolution is always speculative. Pedro represents the speculative future of the speculative future. We are left wondering what utopia will look like after the utopia, and perhaps what an apocalypse looks like after the apocalypse. So in the spirit of speculation, I want to conclude with a few questions I want us to carry with us as we imagine our own decolonial feminist utopias. I want to consider, what does rejuvenation mean in the present as we prepare for the future? Why is it imperative for us to reframe our relationship with each other and with the biosphere in radically different ways, given the alarming rates at which poverty and inequality are rising, climate change is exacerbating, and natural resources are disappearing? If indigenous communities have been warning settlers that our social and economic systems are not sustainable, what catastrophe must happen for everyone to begin an investment in their rejuvenation? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria, for that awesome talk. Okay, next we have, and I apologize once again in advance if I butcher your name, Katarzyna Stępień.
Okay, I know it's terrible for non-natives. So Katarzyna Stępień. Yeah, it's totally different. I know. Sorry for having such a name.
No, my apologies for not being in touch and figuring out how to pronounce it correctly. But you graduated from Nicolaus Copernicus University in Turin with a BA in English Studies. She finished her degree studying at the University of Wolverhampton, England, as a part of a students exchange program. In 2019, she established Student Feminist Society at Nicolaus Copernicus University, with which she organized plenty of events and lectures. Throughout her studies, she had publications about feminism, the Anthropomorphine, and eco-criticism, which continues to be her academic interest. Recently, she has presented some results of her research on conferences organized by George Washington English Graduate Student Association, American Comparative Literature Association, Center for English Translation and Anglo-Portuguese Studies, and the University of Lisbon Center for English Studies. Currently, she is actively involved in many academic projects that are, among others, related to the concept of utopia and dystopia, the relation between local and global perspectives with an emphasis on the aftermath of 2020, and new sincerity authors. During her free time, she translates Anne Walden's poetry into Polish. How do you have free time?
Somehow, I know.
And the title of your talk is The Futures Not ? Ours to See, Anticipation of the Forthcoming Humanity in Solarpunk. And I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you. I'll just, I can share my screen. Yeah. Can someone maybe?
Yeah, I can do that right now.
Perfect.
Oh,
Lovely. Okay. Screen. Okay. It should work somehow. Yeah. Can you see anything?
yeah, it's great.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So let me begin. In my presentation, I'll focus on the emergence of solarpunk and those aspects of the genre that describe the human body and its hybridization. Subsequently, based on short stories from Solarpunk, ecological and fantastical stories in a sustainable world book, Sandwald Stories of Solarpunk and Eco-Speculation, and other Solarpunk anthologies, I'll probe how much emphasis and importance we associate with gender identity nowadays, and how does it look in the speculative version of the future. I'll also evaluate what are the fixed boundaries of humanity that we know nowadays, and how they might imminently change in the future. Afterwards, I'll analyze whether some of the modern technological developments might be dangerous for humanity and its understanding of human body, and why, even in the times of ecological crisis, we still put enormous expectations towards our physicality. Taking into consideration the dystopian reality we live in, it is of no surprise that our consciousness turned to the narrative of the apocalypse rather than recovery. As Ruana Silva, Solarpunk author, has mentioned, since horror and tragedy are everywhere in our reality and mainstream media, they are often in our entertainment as well. As humanity destroys the planet, Solarpunk's punk predecessors, such as cyberpunk, steampunk, dieselpunk, decopunk, atompunk, and nanopunk, depict a hypothetical and rather gloomy vision of the future. Solarpunk, on the contrary, imagines a solar system in which humanity has found a way to be responsible with its environment. As Adam Flynn pointed out in his Solarpunk Notes towards a Manifesto, our futurism is not nihilistic like cyberpunk, and it avoids steampunk's potentially quasi-reactionary tendencies. It is about ingenuity, generativity, independence, and community. Furthermore, Solarpunk is the first creative movement which is consciously and positively responding to the Anthropocene. It reaches for a more positive, sustainable, and realistic view of humanity's near future, and teaches us that humans can learn to live in harmony with the planet once again. Nevertheless, what is important is that it focuses not only on being greener or more eco-friendly, but rather on how to implement the main principles of nature and theories such as Murray Bookchin's social ecology into reality. It calls for creating a non-hierarchical cooperative society that will live in harmony with nature because its member lives in harmony with one another. By creating an intricate mesh of ecology and issues of gender, sexuality, race, and colonialism, it calls for the redefinition of archaically fixed boundaries of how a life should look like. Let me refer to the first Solarpunk anthology ever published, Solarpunk Ecological and Fantastical Stories in a Sustainable World. In the preface, Serena Olberry quotes a conversation she had with the editor of the book, Gerson Ribeiro. Asked why he has chosen Solarpunk, he replied that it was the right time to write stories in self-sustaining fictional civilizations, no matter if those were located in future Earths or alternative history timelines, greener and more inspiring futures or timelines, not troubled by pollution, overpopulation, famine, mass extinctions, and anthropogenic global warming when needed. However, as some of the stories present in the anthology prove sustainable, they are very often rather far from utopian. Because of this very reason, America proved to be a perfect place for a publication of such a collection of stories. Brazil is the place of the publication, is the world's leader in one of the world's leaders in renewable energy, and had 78% of the country's energy in 2018 coming from wind, solar, and hydropower. The USA has the second highest installed wind energy capacity in the world after China. Costa Rica has produced 95% of its electricity from hydro, geothermal, solar, and wind over the past 4 years. And Uruguay is almost 100% powered by renewables. All of them have also problems, to say the least, with liberal utopianism, or as it is the case of Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Brazil, with poverty. No other place on Earth could reflect the future of Solarpunk in a better way. Moreover, as many writers refer in the works to the roots, the same happens with Solarpunk authors. Lisa Bradley, Daniel Jose Older, Alexei Valentin, Andres Silva, Roberta Splender, Carlos Orsi, Lopez de Silva are only a few who are inspired by the Latin roots. Additionally, Solarpunk has a preponderant place to integrate its vision, creativity, art, and aesthetics to the alternatives to the development of the great transition that is taking place in diverse geographies. And thus, the relation with the place, culture, and tradition plays an important role in this creative process. Another dystopian struggle that connects countries I listed above, and obviously not only those, as the whole world shares similar threats, concerns gender inequalities. The primary leading ideology which authorizes oppressions, such as those based on race, class, gender, sexuality, physical abilities, and species, is the same ideology which sanctions the oppression of nature. Thus, without implementing the Solarpunk's methods of sustainability, as it is, for example, in the American case, we cannot even discuss the possibility of liberating any social group from the oppression. Without the nature's liberation and without using nature's wisdom instead of taming it, our future will be a hopeless, dead-end job. Before I move on to the main topic of my presentation and the analysis of Solarpunk's relation with sexuality, let me quickly refer to the origin of Solarpunk. Although its inspirations can be traced to the 1970s and 1980s with the precursors such as The Dispossessed and Always Coming Home by Ursula K. Le Guin, Ecotopia, The Notebooks and Reports of William Weston by Ernest Kallenbach, and Songs from the Stars by Norma Spinard, the formulation of Solarpunk characteristics had been published for the first time in 2008 on Republic of Peace in the form of a post titled From Steampunk to Solarpunk. The author focuses on Solarpunk's renewable energy sources and contradicts its technologies with those praised and depicted by steampunk, where the main interest is related to the usage of old Victorian innovations. In the author's opinion, quote, in Solarpunk, the interest in older technologies is driven by modern economics. For example, if oil isn't a cheap source of energy anymore, then we sometimes do best to revive older technologies that are based on other sources of energy, such as solar power and wind power. According to Claudia Arsenault, the power of this movement lies in the fact that it works from existing technologies, from things we already know are possible. And thus, it acts as a direct instruction rather than a complete imaginative fiction. Even though it sometimes might be very personal and easy to relate to, as it uses devices already available and addresses social struggles already seen, Solarpunk is still a mysterious movement, which characteristics are not entirely clear and organized. However, its main assumptions are epitomized in the name of this movement. The prefix solar means not only obvious connotations such as light, day, and the sun, but reflects also a world with cleaner energy and symbiosis between nature and culture. It also emphasizes the inclusion of all marginalized groups into an equal society where all its members can peacefully share similar living conditions. Nevertheless, what is so punk about being equal and living in harmony with others and nature? Well, as the famous cliche goes on, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Then we can tell that Solarpunk reflects the highest imaginable form of rebellion, counterculture, and individualism, where what matters are not material incomes, but joy and equality. The name itself also reflects that the country of origin of this anthology, of the first anthology, could not have been different. As Fabio Fernandez mentioned in Solarpunk Ecological and Fantastical Stories in a Sustainable World, some of South American countries have, quote, the highest levels of insulation in the world, and its everyday life is indeed a rebellious struggle to make a living in a shattered economy in every possible way. Moving on to the redefinition, or rather a revolution that Solarpunk calls for, one definitely has to mention its depiction of egalitarian systems with slight tendencies towards social anarchism, where personal independence is praised as the highest value. Nevertheless, revolution in general is not only related to the political skirmishness. According to one of the definitions provided by the Oxford Dictionary, it is also a change in conditions, ways of working, beliefs, etc., that affects large numbers of people. That change might sometimes seem to be minor, but is a part of the process, and what needs to be remembered is that real revolutions are the ones that nobody sees coming. One of the ongoing and not always so invisible revolutions is related to the concept of human body and the acceptance of variety we start to acknowledge. Throughout the last century, the biggest change/revolution happened in the field of gender identity and gender representation in a public discourse. As of today, according to the Sustainable Development Goals report from 2020 conducted by the United Nations, full gender equality remains unreachable. However, even though it's not possible to talk about gender equality in the world that we know, with a proper restructuring of previously fixed social relations, it will be. The most visible and interesting change is happening in terms of language. However, how can you degender gender language? According to Todd Brower, a director of the LGBTQA Center of the University of Vermont, increasing number of young people are establishing nouns and pronouns to describe more genders, providing education about the differences between gender expression and gender identity, sex and sexuality, and asserting the rights of themselves and others to choose whether and how to align their self-identified gender and their gender expression. As we all know, Latinx is such a neologism, with a suffix X replacing the O/A ending, typical of grammatical gender in Spanish. It has been seen for the first time around 2004, however, it still remains a pretty undiscovered word, with only 1 out of 4 Latinos in the US knowing the term, with no more than 3% actually using it. From the use of language, we transfer the creation of a whole set of socially accepted behaviors that are indeed nothing more than mere indications of inequality. According to a linguistic relativity hypothesis, aka the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, people tend to perceive reality through the language they use. According to Edward Sapir, we hear and see and otherwise experience very largely as we do because the language habits of our community predispose certain choices of interpretation. Thus, the importance of a proper nomenclature, which in the long terms will bring the freedom and the redefinition of some of the already outdated expressions. In a world described by Solarpunk, expressions such as Latinx work fluently without being novelties. Solarpunk creates the seed of the future safe space and presents a world during the process of this restructuring, when some of the most controversial changes either already happened or are taking place. Historically, the issue of gender has always been widely commented in Solarpunk and its predecessors. In one of them, Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin, we read about Anaris, where the concept of gender has already gone through this restructuring process and where sexuality or monogamy is no longer a central point for organizing a society. The main protagonist at the beginning of his stay at Uros, where the most popular assumption is that, quote, what women call thinking is done with the uterus, states that gender seems a very mechanical basis for the division of labor. And, another quote, a person chooses work according to interests, talent, and strength. He also asks his colleague, Kimura, a question that is central for considering Solarpunk and its relation to gender. What has the sex to do with that? Solarpunk quite often asks itself this question, what sex has to do with anything besides sex? And why would it have to be so strictly organized? For example, in Dust by Danielle Jose Olta, we can find traces of gender fluidity where the anatomy of characters' sexual organs changes, with increasing preferences as they proceed with age. Therefore, Solarpunk creates a future that is free of heterosexism beyond monogamy or even beyond gender altogether. In a similar way to gender fluidity and refusal of a binary gender distinction in Solarpunk, Latinx describes a word where deciding whether some things represent an option A or an option B is not necessary. According to feminist and queer Chicana scholar Gloria Anzaldúa, the complex racial history of Latin America's change has created a unique mindset, a refusal to conform to racial and social binaries, and an identity based on the mixing of cultures, that on any one solid static caste designation. This mixing does not represent a state halfway through, but rather a completeness in itself. X in Latin stands for freedom of being whatever a person who uses it needs. Finding new ways of expression present in Solarpunk is part of the strive for redefinition of humans' place in the biosphere, and is already started in reality. Crossing the boundary between human and non-human distinction has often found a reflection in the involvement of technology and man-made objects that possess their own abilities to think and reason. Historically, as earlier as in ancient Greece, the idea of artificial intelligence found its way to people's consciousness in the form of myths and legends. From mythological tales as a prototype of a robot through Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Homunculus and Rossum's Universe of Robots by Karel Čapek, the idea of creating a machine that thinks achieved a form that we know today in the 1950s with the publication of Alan Turning's revolutionary paper. Since then, this concept was rambling in academic heads, and in 1956 materialized as the Dartmouth Workshop, which is considered the birthplace of artificial intelligence. This event was followed by various attempts to create a perfect version of a robot that resembles a human being with its body shape and movements. To list only a few among those that were created, we find the first humanoid robot, Wabot, the first anthropomorphic manipulator, Greenman, the first bipedal humanoid able to run, Asimo, ping-pong playing Tokyo, the most dynamic humanoid robot ever created, Atlas, and inspired by Audrey Hepburn's facial features, Sophia. Moreover, crossing the boundaries of human-non-human distinction allows anticipation of society equal in gender terms. As Donna Haraway stated in her Cyborg Manifesto, referring to the idea of postgenderism, science fiction, literature, and modern medicine are full of cyborgs, defined as being, quote, between organism and machine, with power that was not generated in the history of sexuality. Similarly, Francesca Ferrando emphasizes an evolution might as well provide a multiplication of genders, not necessarily related to the feminine and masculine archetypes. Nevertheless, this evolution and healing of the terrible cleavages of gender, as Donna Haraway has stated, will not happen by itself. As long as society continues to be divided, the concept of artificial intelligence will only be a tool for further homosexism, racism, and marginalization. Ferrando continues by pointing cultural background as the main element of artificial intelligence reception and political, social, and economic factors as crucial for its development. She continues by saying that, quote, humans have to undergo a radical deconstruction of the human as a fixed notion and focus more on its evolution and differences within our species. By cherishing differences found in humanity, we can reach the level of equality in gender terms. Moreover, according to Rossi Braidotti, the critique of woman as a sign of a devalorized otherness is not biological, it is biocultural, that is to say, historical. Breaking up with the archaic prejudice of gender and the outdated binary distinction for a man and a woman opens plenty of new possibilities of interpretation and discard the traditional symbolic hierarchy from the old days. Thus, the abandonment of binary position leads not only to the closure of the mind-body Cartesian dualism, but also to a realization regarding culturally associated concepts. By bringing up the topic of digitalization of life, Solarpunk helps to reflect on the beauty of the bare form of liveliness, and thus allows such a change as fluidity or a complete abandonment of gender. However, before we turn into a complete robotization of our everyday life, the whole variety of minor changes can be pursued. In Soylent Green is People, we read about gen therapy. In When Kingdoms Collide, about chlorophyll humans, and in Sun in the Heart, we find, quote, the complex solar panels which fed nanomachines injected into their bloodstream. The improvements of humanity, posthumanism per se, found on the pages of Solarpunk stories fit the imagined future of humanity. With the rejection of human weaknesses, we are approaching the complete transformation of humanity, at least a humanity as we know it today. The anticipated version brings hope for those who have been mistreated or forgotten for years. Nevertheless, interestingly enough, Solarpunk does not always praise those changes as improvements. It tells more about the valorization of humanity itself with all its varieties. It crosses a thin line of human-non-human duality just to help its readers in a reflection of our own vitality and resilience. To conclude, some skeptics might accuse Solarpunk of being a sugar-coated and utopian vision of the future, a fairy tale about human nature's symbiosis, and that has no logical basis. It depicts a progress that as some, as Oscar Wilde, perceive as, quote, the realization of utopias. However, it does not focus on a progress that came out of thin air, but emphasizes rather changes and the importance of a process that leads to progress. It might be perceived as utopian in some of its assumptions, but this form of utopianism is different from the one present in other movements. It is not delusional and utopian in a negative sense. It does not create a perfect place without considering present obstacles and social conditions that limit personal autonomy and sexual expression. It approaches the topic of utopia from the perspective of a constant augmentation rather than an endpoint of development, and notices the unideal conditions with possible threats humanity might face in the future. Solarpunk, with its utopianism, is a place where the constant process is needed, as society is not an unchangeable, stable idea, and new amendments should be made as often as possible. In Solarpunk, by evaluating and redefining our relation with the surroundings, technology, others, and nature, we learn how to welcome diversity into our lives. By switching towards a more liberated and cooperative model of society with an influence of sustainable technology available nowadays, Solarpunk overcomes strict and archaic gender distinctions and creates a sometimes overly positive world where everyone's welcome. It focuses on people, and as Adam Flynn has stated in his Solarpunk Notes Towards Manifesto, presents a speculative version of the future with a human face and dirt behind its ears. Thanks to the immense motley of themes it deals with, Solarpunk imagines a safe harbor for our future affairs, with dreamlike aesthetics similar to Hayao Miyazaki movies, based on a belief in humanity, hope for a better tomorrow, and a change that we have to undergo as a society. Thus, my last conclusion is that Solarpunk presents a perfect space for expression for those who identify as Latinx. These are some of my sources, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for that. Okay, so next we have Matthew David Goodwin, who is focused on the ways science fiction, fantasy, and digital culture are being used by Latinx authors. He is the author of the Latinx Files and the editor of two anthologies, Latinx Rising and Speculative Fiction for Dreamers. He is currently an assistant professor in the Chicano Studies Department at the University of New Mexico. And his talk is entitled Gloria Anzaldúa and the Making of an Alien Consciousness.
Okay, thanks. Thank you to Cathryn and Christina and everyone for coming today. So today I'll be talking about the alien consciousness, this concept of Gloria Anzaldúa, and how it's interwoven with her use of the space alien. I'll talk about how she expands on Jose Vasconcelos' theory of la raza cósmica, and how her poems in Borderlands, La Frontera, Don't Give In, Chicanita, and Interface further develop this concept of the alien consciousness. In this bridge, Call My Back from 1981, Gloria Anzaldúa recalls her sense of being different as a child. Quote, "The whole time growing up, I felt that I was not of this earth, an alien from another planet. I'd been dropped on my mother's lap, but for what purpose?" End quote. In her search for that purpose, Anzaldúa employed the space alien as a central metaphor throughout her career, in the manner of her other metaphors like Borderlands and Napantla. And each metaphor kind of has its own like benefits. And the benefit of the space alien is really its multiplicity. It can be used in so many different ways and depicted in so many different ways. In describing herself as alien, Anzaldúa is pointing to a particular quality of the space alien, that it's strange and foreign, at least from the human point of view. So this is an aspect of the space alien that she commonly emphasizes. For example, she writes, quote, "We queers come from all colors, all classes, all races, all time periods. Our role is to link people with each other. Blacks with Jews, with Indians, with Asians, with whites, with extraterrestrials," end quote. The extent of the unifying potential of queerness is being shown with the mention of the space alien here. So that is, people of different races and classes can come together through queerness hasta los extraterrestres. This utopian formation of the queerness points to the fuller version of Anzaldúa's purpose for the space alien, that it's correlated with her vision of radical inclusivity. The space alien is not only strange to humans at times, but can also be a source of horror. So one alien Anzaldúa turns to a number of times is the monstrous alien from the film Alien from 1979. In 1980, Anzaldúa had an operation and because of a life-threatening infection. And a month later, she wrote this poem called "The Alien," in which the alien comes out of a person undergoing surgery. So in this poem, the aliens create a reaction of horror in the narrator, and they're a threat. However, the narrator also expresses a feeling that the narrator has not done enough to embrace the alien inside her. So in one version, this is an unpublished poem, and there's many versions. But in one version, she says, quote, "What if I had loved the alien, looked it in the face, said, yes, you are a part of me. I cannot deny you. I cannot turn my back on you," end quote. So the narrator survives the operation only by extracting the threat within her. So in giving voice to the alien, if only briefly, however, Anzaldúa shows the high stakes at play in the search for the purpose of the alien, that it's a measure of one's ability to be inclusive, to embrace that which is unknown or threatening to one's own ego. And this poem gives a sense of personal limitations, essentially. So these personal horrors expressed by the space alien also open up a political experience of horrific projection. As she says in the interview, quote, "The movie Alien affected me greatly because I really identified with it. In the film, it seemed like they were taking all the things they fear and hate about themselves and projecting them onto the monster, just like we did with blacks, like people do with queers. I think that's how the soul is. That's what they did with women's sexuality and with women." Even though, end quote, even though Anzaldúa is stepping toward taking the point of view of the space alien in this quote, she still emphasizes the horrific aspect of being alien. The specific examples she's giving are about being rejected or ejected, and so the space alien remains this position of abjection. However, Anzaldúa also creates another purpose for the space alien, not the human view of the space alien as strange and horror-inducing, but the space alien view of humanity and how the space alien lives and thinks. The key aspect of the space alien that comes in here is that the space alien would be distant from the concerns of humanity. The space alien has an extraterrestrial perspective on humanity as unified on some level. And this is an aspect going way back to the 2nd century Roman writer Lucian, who depicted space aliens as kind of philosophical, as a philosophical exercise. So in the final chapter of Borderlands La Frontera, Anzaldúa develops more fully the purpose she intuited in her sense of being an alien from another planet. She states, "An alien consciousness is presently in the making. She describes the basic form of this future consciousness as one that is tolerant of ambiguity, contradiction, and perplexity, and that embraces multiplicity rather than thinking dualistically. Anzaldúa writes, quote, "She has a plural personality. She operates in a pluralistic mode. Nothing is thrust out, the good, the bad, and the ugly, nothing rejected, nothing abandoned," end quote. But another way, the alien consciousness is radically inclusive. Okay, the alien consciousness embraces the child who feels themselves alien. At the same time that it expresses the purpose that lay hidden inside Anzaldúa's alienation, it takes away the simplicity of most utopian thinking as the alien consciousness involves, quote, "a struggle of flesh, struggle of borders, and an inner war," end quote. The alien consciousness, however, is not just the action of embracing the alien, but becoming alien. Anzaldúa's particular formulation of the alien consciousness is a creative repurposing of José Vasconcelos's philosophy of la raza cósmica. Vasconcelos argues in his book from 1925 that the many races of humanity will in the distant future merge together to form a new mixed race people, the ultimate mestiza. Vasconcelos' views on race were influenced by theosophy, quasi-religious movement, which held that humanity is comprised of what they called root races that are basically extraterrestrial in origin. Anzaldúa's concept of the alien consciousness, in this sense, is the form of consciousness of la raza cósmica. That is, the cosmic race would have an alien consciousness. Vasconcelos's views on race, though influential to the Chicanic civil rights movement, have been criticized over the years for their essentialist depictions of indigenous groups and Blacks. And Anzaldúa, I think, tries to avoid this to a certain degree, by making a virtue of the approach rather than the conclusion. As she writes, quote, "Opposite to the theory of the pure Aryan and to the policy of racial purity that white America practices, his theory is one of inclusivity," end quote. Anzaldúa then develops this idea of la raza cósmica, expanding on the original race-based notion. Anzaldúa makes it clear that she's broadening her focus beyond race simply by this switching to consciousness. For Anzaldúa, la raza cósmica might produce the alien consciousness, but there are other ways for this consciousness to form. This idea is expressed by the multiple names she gives to the alien consciousness. A mestiza consciousness, the new mestiza consciousness, una conciencia de mujer, the consciousness of the borderlands. So Teresa Delgadillo describes Anzaldúa's new mestiza as creating, quote, "the possibility for multiple alliances rather than a singular and nationalist embrace of a common heritage." That it exemplifies a theory of Chicana subjectivity rooted but not fixed in the experience and epistemology of the US-Mexico border and of queer Chicana feminists, end quote. A radically inclusive consciousness has, for Anzaldúa, the potential to be formed wherever there is some sort of borderland, spiritual, social, or physical. So Anzaldúa offers two fictional depictions of the alien consciousness in Borderlands La Frontera. The first is Don't Give In Chicanita, and it shows the original kind of race-based notion of the alien consciousness and La Raza Cósmica. And the second interface shows her expanded version of that. Don't Give In Chicanita is set in a post-apocalyptic US and provides a vision of this original alien consciousness. And it's essentially La Raza Cósmica. And she writes, "Perhaps we'll be dying of hunger as usual, but will be members of a new species. Skin tone between black and bronze, second eyelid under the first. The power to look at the sun through naked eyes. Though this new being is not, it's not a space alien, yeah? It is alien to humanity, with Anzaldúa using a traditional space alien characteristic, the second eyelid, to depict that alienness. Furthermore, Vasconcelos' concept of La Raza Cósmica certainly is overtly utopian. And Anzaldúa is, at least in this one depiction, kind of playing with that. And you know, there's poverty, there's violence, and they're just surviving in this landscape. So Don't Give In Chicanita is that there's more to this poem. There's a lot more to this poem that's very interesting, but I want to talk about interface more. Don't Give In Chicanita is a speculative vision of the original alien consciousness as envisioned by Gloria Anzaldúa. But she also provides this updated version in interface. So it's a love story involving a space alien, Layla, and the unnamed human narrator with family roots in Texas and who lives in New York. The poem describes the development of the romantic relationship between the narrator and Layla, as well as Layla's transformation from an invisible alien into something new. At the end of the poem, the narrator recounts bringing Layla home to Texas at Christmas in order to meet her family. If we turn our attention to the plot, to the development of Layla, then it becomes apparent that the poem is expressing this making of the alien consciousness. The narrative begins with the human and alien on opposite sides of a dimensional border. The narrator inhabits the physical world and Layla the nominal world, this kind of pulsing, pure sound world. Though living in these two distinct realms, they're able to meet at the interface. The development of the alien consciousness begins with the alien being present in the world, yet intangible and nearly invisible. But as their relationship develops, Layla takes on more substance, leaving traces of physicality, such as creases on a bedsheet where she's lying and becoming, quote, like dense fog. As the alien is embraced by the narrator, she becomes visible, historical, and comes out of the closet, as it were. Eventually, the narrator can touch her, and it's at this point that the two have this romantic encounter. And I'll describe it here. A cool tendril pressing between my legs, entering her finger, I thought, but it went on and on. I wasn't scared, just astonished. Rain drummed against my spine, turned to steam as it rushed through my veins. This beautifully described erotic moment evokes the alien-human abduction stories commonly depicted in popular culture, in which the alien probes the abductee. It rearranges the meaning, however, to create a moment of sexual awakening. Layla then takes full physical form through a kind of quasi-birthing scene. And I'll describe a little bit of that. My roommate thought I was having an affair. I was radiant, she said. Layla had begun to swell. I started hurting a little. When I started cramping, she pushed out her fingers, forearm, shoulder. Then she stood before me, fragile skin, sinews tender as baby birds and as transparent. This part of the poem has the narrator take the alien into herself in the embrace of motherhood. And this is the tipping point in the story, where Layla's becoming something new, something distinct from this division of physical and nominal world. It's the birth of a consciousness, and it comes with birth pains. So Layla becomes the interface, the title of the poem. But this is not an X-Files kind of human alien hybrid based on race or genetics. And it's not exactly a human mind and a human body. This is an alien consciousness birthed into a kind of humanoid body. So it's an embodied consciousness, a non-dualistic way of alternative to the human-alien hybrid. Something really completely new, and it's formed through queer love rather than racial mixing. Finally, the narrator takes this final step, bringing Layla home to the family. And the narrator says, "Last Christmas, I took her home to Texas. Mom liked her. Is she a les?" my brothers asked. I said, "No, just an alien." Layla laughed. For me, this ending is powerful. The response given by the narrator is ironic, the joke being that the brothers would find it stranger that she were a lesbian than a space alien. But to laugh off a threat can be a form of power, even if it may be the only option one has. Layla's laugh at the irony of the situation, that she is in fact a space alien, grabs hold of that power and ends the story. The joke also is that they couldn't possibly understand who Layla is. The alien consciousness is hard to imagine if you're holding too tightly to binaries. Layla's laughter at the end is indicative of the alien consciousness. That is, the alien consciousness laughs while crossing borders. Anzaldúa interface shows the potential of the space alien to express a powerful form of solidarity that is rooting in Chicana subjectivity and then expands into radical inclusivity. To conclude, Anzaldúa's vision of the alien consciousness gives, I think, gives a unique ability to form a vision of future solidarities. So, for example, in a discussion about solidarity, Anzaldúa notes that normally it's been kind of bound up to the marketplace, about representation in the marketplace. And she posits that, quote, "we need to meet on a broader communal ground," end quote. And I think the space alien is an interesting kind of site to talk about that future solidarity. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Matt. So finally, we have Danielle Garcia-Karr, who is a graduate student at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. She's a Frontera native who grew up in Brownsville, Texas. Her area of focus is the intersection of culture, race, gender, sexuality, and language in speculative fiction. She's working toward a degree in English Studies, a master's degree in English Studies, and certificates in Gender and Women's Studies and Mexican American Studies. She is a student, teacher, citizen, mother, and author. Her methodology and pedagogy are ones of activism and decoloniality. And her talk is entitled Gods of Jade and Shadow, Speculative Fiction's Role in Cultural Critique and Social Change.
Awesome. Can you enable screen share?
Yes, I can do that right now.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Hello. Thanks for coming to my talk and all y'all's talk, obviously. Okay, so the stories we tell are important. I can stop right there, right? Thanks for coming. No, just kidding. Both the content and the symbolism that is created in the fictional world craft our perceptions of the real world. And they reflect our perceptions of the real world. And we can tell stories that are filled with heroic cisgender white males adventuring and saving the day, and beautiful, fair, simpering girls in need of rescue. Or we can challenge, we can push back, we can subvert these ideologies in order to enact social change. In the book, Gods of Jade and Shadow, Silvia Moreno Garcia not only examines each of these essential societal elements through the medium of speculative fiction, but also metacognitively challenges the reader to critically examine their own role in perpetuating or changing stories. In this decolonization and reclamation of traditional folk tales, the protagonist, Cassiopeia Thun, faces many challenges as she throws off the white male perception of who she should be to assert the validity and value of who she is. About me, Allow me to begin this paper by framing myself in this conversation that I'm entering into. Like Dr. Merla-Watson said, I grew up in Brownsville, right along the border. La Frontera was my backyard, my childhood, my life. I grew up there never knowing anything different. In fact, in class recently, I followed my family tree generation through generation through generation, through Texas, through Mexico, through before. You know that saying, we didn't cross the border crossed us? Totally the case for my family. This matters because it frames my approach and my understanding. Regardless, even in this space, I was often excluded for being feminist, for being dominant, for not conforming to expectations of women and girls in a patriarchal society. Gender roles, ideals, and expectations attempted to rule my life, as they do many women, especially Black, Indigenous people of color, from early childhood onwards. However, like many feminists, I pushed back and struggled against them daily. The idea of gender is enforced within communities and from outside them. And one of the major ways that this is done is through storytelling and through the media. Regardless of the format, books, movies, TV, oral tradition, the stories reinforce societal expectations of gender roles. As argued by Daphne Taylor Garcia and Alicia Arrizon, Western gender ideology is the result of colonialism, and it's designed as a way to justify male domination, economic class exploitation, racism, imperialism, and ecological irresponsibility. Through the lens of culture, gender ideology denotes a set of characteristics about men and women's behaviors, lifestyles, and ways of thinking, preferences, and life orientations. Patricia Nelson argues that women serve as archetypes and that the word woman and the concept are simultaneously idealized and vilified, which reduces the idea of woman to symbol rather than acknowledging a real woman's complexity. In Mexican culture, gender norms are defined largely by the duality of Marianismo and machismo, which represents the gender role phenomenon based on traditional cultural norms and the impact of Catholicism. Gender is a colonial construct, which is defined by patriarchy and by heteronormativity. Therefore, challenging gender, queering it, is decolonization. It is both possible and necessary in order to throw off the subjugation of women and the ideology that demeans them as the root of all evil, and to reclaim them as powerful and worthy of attention and praise in their own right. As a form of social activism, Chicanx authors use speculative fiction as a vehicle to subvert dominant ideologies. To do this, they unframe, as detailed by Gaspar de Alba, the female icons, figures, and characters by retelling their stories in creative ways with intersectional characters who queer boundaries and borders. Using genres and formats from which they are usually excluded, ones that have been used against them to perpetuate dangerous and damaging stereotypes and misinformation, ones dominated by cis-het white men. In case you're wondering, cis-het means cisgender, heterosexual. Chicanx authors rewrite the stories, folktales, fairy tales, and myths meant to control and enforce conformativity to instead further the intersectional feminist agenda of freedom, agency, and equity. Left out of the LGBTQIA feminist and Chicano movements, Chicanas and Latinas needed to make their own movement with their own iconography and ideology, furthered by their own stories. Through rewriting stories, retelling history, they are able to manifest and display the decolonial imaginary. The decolonial imaginary is a rupturing space, the alternative to which is written history. As Bettis describes it, and Moreno Garcia utilizes it, the notion of the decolonial imaginary is a means not only of finding the women so hidden from history, but also a way of honoring their agency. So I've used frame a couple of times now, so I'm going to define it now that I've talked about it. To frame is to define in a certain way, to isolate and highlight something specific, but it also is to put blame on. Framing contains, it limits, it binds, it borders. In her book, Unframing the Bad Woman, Alicia Gaspar de Alba calls the process of removing oneself, one's character archetypes from their boxes, unframing them. And once the frames are broken, they can be reframed in protest frames by movements like the Chicana feminist movement to generate collective identities and promote social actions. Using this framework, I will identify the ways in which feminist icons are unframed through the work of Silvia Moreno Garcia in Gods of Jade and Shadow. In this way, not only are historical figures and characters reclaimed, but so are the women living in similar situations here today in the real world. A little note on speculative fiction. Through speculative fiction, Moreno Garcia is able to accomplish several things. Firstly, this genre is often othered. It's often considered frivolous. It's just entertainment. So it kind of gets ignored and it can fly under the radar of some of the censure and white suppression. As fiction, it's pretend. And therefore, it gets ignored again, and it can do some subversive work because it introduces the readers to new ideas which challenge the dominant ideological belief systems. Additionally, speculative fiction allows the author to step back into the past and reimagine it. It takes so-called history and changes the narrative. It changes the focus. It gives voices to characters who've been ignored and left out. And while it contains monstrosities and atrocities, it juxtaposes them with hope. In the end of Gods of Jade and Shadow, the oppressed do manage to escape and hopefully have a better life. Part of the work which authors of speculative fiction do is to reimagine figures of folklore and mythology. They take feminist icons and change their stories from cautionary tales meant to condemn and control women to stories of power and agency. In reimagining the past, they create new possibilities for the future. Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno Garcia is a tale of a poor young girl mistreated by her family. She spends her time cleaning and caring for those who treat her poorly. In fact, Moreno Garcia draws a direct parallel between her main character, Cassiopeia, and the fairy tale many of us are familiar with, Cinderella. However, she also makes the distinction that while she might seem like a Cinderella-like figure, she is not. Cassiopeia is nowhere near the fairest of them all. Do you know what that means? Fairest? It means lightest skinned. It has so permeated our language and our culture that we often forget this and take it to mean beautiful or best. And whitest is not the most beautiful or the best. Cassiopeia herself struggles with her own ideas about beauty and her own image because she is swarthy. She is of Maya ancestry. This struggle is the result of the norms and expectations placed upon her and the values of her society. This is still true today across the country. People are treated poorly based on the color of their skin. In this story, Moreno Garcia establishes the link between Cinderella as a way to connect with her audience by grounding the story in their understanding. However, she quickly decenters the white colonialist perspective and tells a very different tale. And one of the ways this is done is through the allusion with the tale of La Llorona. Her story is retold through Cassiopeia. Even though Cassiopeia is without children, she too runs off with a young man, really the god Huncame, or at least is presumed to have done so. She repeatedly dresses in white as La Llorona does, and there's a whole host of water imagery associated with her from lakes and rivers and oceans and cenotes. However, the most pertinent association occurs near the end of the story when she takes her own life at the lake, where she sank to her knees and slid into the water and the lake swallowed her whole. However, unlike La Llorona, she's not doomed for all eternity to roam the waterways for her sins. In fact, this is the way that Cassiopeia wins the challenge to make the journey along the Black Road and arrive at the city of Xibalba before her cousin and helps return the god Huncame to his throne. This is the way she wins. And because the story is changed in this way, the figure of the myth and the legend is unframed and given the potential for freedom. All right, unframing and decolonizing with color symbolism. If I were to enter any English classroom and ask, what do you know about color symbolism? The chances are super good that they would say that white is pure and good. And if I were to ask, what does the color black symbolize? They'd be like, evil. This is a very Eurocentric colonial perspective. What repercussions does it have on the lives of people if we're told again and again and again through the stories that we're told that lighter is always better? Not just more attractive, but essentially elementally superior. The stories we tell matter. Even the characters within the novel metacognitively comment upon this truth. In Gods of Jade and Shadow, Moreno Garcia employs a lot of color symbolism purposefully. However, her symbolism refuses to follow this paradigm. Instead, in her work, Black is beautiful, magical, and powerful. At first, this distinction is unclear because we have Cassiopeia, who's struggling against this internalized colorism and racism. And she describes herself in unflattering terms due to her complexion. She describes her luck as black, blacker than black. The internalized racism and colorism that is the result of colonialism is clear. However, as she discovers the secret of her family and her ancestry and meets an actual Maya god, Huncame, her perspective changes. This god is a warrior king. He is beauty sketched from smoke and dreams, his skin bronze. In fact, it is a deep shade of brown and beautiful with blue-black hair, black as ink, and a dark gaze. Every kind of dark and black imagery is associated with him. He is beauty, he is power, he is royalty, and his kingdom, Xibalba, the Black City, is the home of the obsidian throne and the black road, and described by the allure of shadows and the glimmer of obsidian, where there is as much beauty as there is terror in the night, whose embrace is velvet. Through associating not with the white male colonialist god, but the queered version of the Mayan one, Casiopeia's ideas about herself, her worth, and her capabilities change. By telling a story about the intersectionally oppressed character, by drawing her from the margins into the center stage, by rewriting familiar stories to include Black Indigenous people of color, Moreno Garcia decolonizes these fairy tales and asserts the validity of Indigenous cultures and peoples. All right, unframing and decolonizing with gender. Throughout the story, Moreno Garcia blurs the lines of gender with her characters. Women's roles traditionally are perceived to be defined by the Virgin Mary in Marianismo, whose ideal of purity and passivity and traits of being internally immaculate and giving, and whose sole sexual purpose is procreation, are the guideposts. And while Cassiopeia is assigned female at birth and embodies the physical norms associated with the female gender expression of wearing dresses and skirts and having long hair, her characterization does not align with the paradigms of Marianismo. Cassiopeia is smart. She is smarter than her male cousin Martín, much to his chagrin. She loves to read. She's good at math. She is far from passive. She constantly challenges Martín from the very beginning of the book to the end. The main showdown is a competition between the cousins, which Cassiopeia wins. While Cassiopeia is forced to serve, to do the laundry, scrub the floors, dust the living room, she does not do so willingly or kindly or patiently like Cinderella. She is fiery, she is without humility, and she is with a yearning for a sliver of freedom. In Gods of Jade, In Gods of Jade and Shadow, the pertinent fairy tale addresses Cinderella. However, mythologies include Maya, Greek, Aztec, and Christian. Scholars, including Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, comment on how Mayan culture astonishes all who study it, and it is often compared to Greek culture. Ancient Greek culture has prestige. It is seen as knowledgeable. Although as complex, Mayan culture rarely receives this recognition. The focus on the stars, the gods, and Cassiopeia's name relate the story to Greek culture as a way to remind the audience of the humanity and validity of both. We need to talk specifically also about one figure in Aztec mythology, Coyoshaki. She is the goddess of the moon. Because she challenges her brother, her body was cut into pieces and thrown into the sky. Her character is recast in this tale, and her story comes through the character of Hunkame. He too poses a challenge to his brother. He too has his body cut into pieces. However, he is a Maya god and male, and through him, Coyolxauhqui is queered. The lines between Maya and Aztec are blended, and so are those between male and female. In the end, Hunkame, with the help of Cassiopeia, reclaims his rightful place, his power, his throne, disrupting the historical tales and records, subverting the gender ideologies. These are ways in which these figures are unframed and their stories decolonized. The stories we tell are important. They can either enforce artificial and arbitrary gender roles, or they can push against them to normalize alternate perspectives and make way for different ways of being. In conclusion, in reimagining the past through the decolonial lens and unframing the Eurocentric Cinderella story, Moreno Garcia opens the reader's eyes to possibility. She humanizes them. She shows Black, Indigenous people of color, Indigenous mythologies, Mexican folklore as valuable, interesting, and powerful. She allows the reader the opportunity to internalize new ideologies in which the white cishet male is not the only one who matters. She enables them to take these new ideas forth into the world and enact social change. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Danielle. So thank you everyone for your really insightful presentations. And I love how these themes of reimagining, futurity, decolonial feminism, ideas about utopian and the dystopian, and ways of imagining new kinds of social relations and forms of connection and solidarity. We might be, and Christina, I have to check in with you on this, we might be running out of time, but I believe that we have a little bit of time left for maybe a few just comments and questions.
Yeah, we do.
Okay. So I certainly have comments and questions, but I'd like to give the panelists an opportunity to voice any comments or questions first. So I only see Christina's face. Okay, so.
No, I don't think there's any.
I have one quick
Or Matt.
question.
Okay, go ahead, Matt. Yeah.
Okay. But it's for María. I had forgot that Lunar Braceros was the collective. It's set in Ecuador.
So
right?
the collective is set in what's present day Ecuador, which in this future moment has been fought over the territory and become this autonomous territory in the Amazon called Chinganasa, and it's based off like the group that led it at some point in the 21st century, 22nd century they were inspired by the Zapatistas, who were able to like create their own autonomous kind of space, like autonomous space. So that's
but it's completely fictional, like the.
It's completely fictional. Yes. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Everything is almost completely fictional. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the U.S. gets transformed into what is a new nation state called the New World Order. And there's the reservation system called Cali, Texas, which is the Union of California and Texas, which has become a reservation for mostly Chicanos, who are now just disposable labor and being sent to the moon as Lunar Braceros.
So I'll just give a quick comment. And then I also have a question for María. So Matt, I don't know if you were just being polite, for lack of a better word, but sort of that sexual tentacle scene. I'm wondering if it's a play on like Japanese tentacle porn or erotica, or that if it's like purposely kind of intervening within that genre, which I believe is a bit misogynist and geared towards like, you know, the male view.
Yeah, I mean, this is, you know, from Borderlands. So it's you know, that's a long, it's a long time ago. I honestly don't think so, but
Okay.
I think it's connected, you know, tentacles is like, it's a quick way of also like connecting to the space alien. Yeah.
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 And then María, so yeah, so I have to ask this question, and I've been thinking about this question for quite some time, since I first read this book, and I've taught it, and I've talked about this with my students. And so, you know, as you're talking about creating these, the way the novel is creating these kind of like radical frameworks of undoing and decolonial feminism, how do you, because in some ways this novel reminds me of the conclusion of the short story Refugio by, oh goodness, I cannot remember the name of, but it centers on this like Chicana lesbian vampire and her like badass kind of like shape-shifting, you know, lover. And at the end of the short story, instead of, I guess, what I think a lot of us hoped for, where instead of turning like maybe a queer like Chicana at the end of the story, it sort of the vampire and the role of vampires to like protect like Larissa and like the specific barrio in LA. And so the story kind of, I would argue, like weirdly reinforces or recenters, you know, sort of like cisgender male character. And I sort of felt the same thing about, you know, Pedro at the end of this novel. And I was just wondering like how you make sense of that in your own work.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ending is just that I try to point to it is like they just kind of leave us, and Pedro's supposed to presumably leave Chinganasa to try to find his parents, to also fight in the revolution, and he is the hope of everything. And so, you know, we don't get much of Pedro. Like he's just a vehicle for us to get to know this other story. And so the framework, or why I'm interested in Lunar Braceros in a book that's actually about Ecuador, is because I'm really thinking about what does, you know, the new leftist governments or like socialism of the 21st century in the Andean region have often actually failed to really create radically different worlds. So I was interested in why these two Chicana authors at UC San Diego they actually saw Utopia in Ecuador, where I don't necessarily see it, but, you know, indigenous people have been fighting for Utopia. And ultimately Pedro becomes the site of Utopia. And so I'm trying to grapple with thinking about decoloniality as both utopian, dystopian, who gets to be the head of that? Like, can Pedro really be that? We're not told, just the same way that we're not told whether these new leftist governments are going to actually create really inequitable change, which again leave us in this impending doom that there is no hope. And so I'm really interested in, if not Pedro, I'm interested in this idea that a radically different world, it has to be outside of the nation state. And that's ultimately where I'm trying to grapple with. But I agree, like we're left with Pedro and we're like, you know, it's like this odd open ending that leaves us all pretty dissatisfied.
Thank you. Does anyone else have questions, comments?
These were all really fascinating talks. Thank you. Any other comments? I'll stop recording.
Thank you, everyone.